All right, so chapter 26. This will not be on this next exam. This is final exam stuff. Now, chapter 26 is nutrition and metabolism. We're going to focus more on metabolism part and how the cells are making ATP and the biochemical pathways that they use for that. This is what you're going to learn. It's not that bad. Okay? What this shows us is that we have both carbohydrate, lipid, and protein pathways that can be used to generate ATP. The main pathway is the carbohydrate pathway, but the lipids and the proteins feed into various parts of the carbohydrate pathway. So there isn't necessarily separate pathways. For part of them, yes. But all these pathways feed in some way. We're going to focus first and mainly on the carbohydrate pathways. Okay. So when we look at carbohydrate metabolism, there's three groups of reactions. And within these groups of reactions, there are subreactions. Now, you've heard of glycolysis before. You've heard of the citric acid cycle before. You've heard of electron transport before. I try to kind of stick with the book on this and use some of the same terms that the book does. If you've had micro, you've had some of this, so most of what you're hearing is going to be the same. I don't know if in micro they talk about matrix versus membrane reactions or not, but matrix versus membrane reactions talk about basically refer to where these reactions are occurring. So we have glycolysis, matrix reactions, which include the reduction of pyruvate and the citric acid cycle, or the Krebs cycle. And the membrane reactions are basically electron transport and oxidative phosphorylation. There's two separate processes. And as I showed you in the previous diagram, there are side reactions that can feed into the main carbohydrate pathway. Now, so we're talking about cellular respiration. You've heard me use that term before. Cellular respiration is the process whereby the cells are using glucose and oxygen to produce ATP. And there's the reaction for it right here. Balanced and everything. Glucose plus 6 oxygens will produce carbon dioxide and water and energy in the form of ATP. Now later on I'll explain to you why we get the 36 to 38. Why it's not just 36 or 38, but you could have either. Now, if we look at this reaction, and this is basically that whole carbohydrate pathway that was in green on that first slide, we have several reactants. We have the glucose as a reactant, and we have oxygen as our reactants. It's a chemical reaction. Much, much simplified chemical reaction, but nonetheless still a reaction. And what we get then is carbon dioxide and water. We don't really count ATP as a product because it's in the form of energy, but we get 36 to 38 ATP. You probably all learned this reaction here in 5th grade, 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade, definitely high school when you took high school biology. And I'm sure you also learned the reaction for photosynthesis. And if you look at the reaction for photosynthesis, there is a connection to this cellular respiration reaction. Can anybody tell me what the chemical equation for photosynthesis is? Okay, so what would it look like?
Carbon dioxide plus H2O.
Carbon dioxide and water.
Equals oxygen and glucose.
And where is the energy coming from to rearrange the molecular bonds between carbon dioxide and water to produce the glucose? That takes energy. From the sun. Energy cannot be created or destroyed. The law of conservation of energy. Energy cannot be created or destroyed. It has to come from somewhere. And in order to produce this glucose, which is essentially stored energy, we have to get energy from somewhere. And we have a perpetual energy machine called the sun. Well, not quite perpetual. Another 7 or 8 billion years it'll be gone, but so will we, so it doesn't matter. Right? So that sun's energy then is stored in the chemical bonds of glucose. Now, can we stand in the sun and absorb that sunlight and use the energy from the sun to make sugars for our cells? Or can our cells use that energy of the sun directly? No. We can get a nice suntan out of it, but that's about it. So how then do we get that sun's energy? We eat the plants, right? You see The Lion King, The Circle of Life? You want me to sing it for you? I won't, trust me. So when we eat the plants, when we have a salad, let's say, along with the oxygen that we're breathing in, we then run the photosynthesis reaction in reverse. We break those bonds of the glucose, and we get carbon dioxide and water. And that's exactly what the plants use to make the glucose. And we get 36 to 38 ATP. So really, what is that ATP? If you follow this energy, what is that ATP? Sunlight, right? Sunlight. That's how we get sunlight. That's how we use the energy of the sun. We have to use it indirectly. So there is a definite link between cellular respiration and photosynthesis. Now on the exam, when I ask you, why do we need oxygen? If you write, so we can breathe, I'm just going to give you 0 in the entire exam. That's not why we need oxygen. We breathe. The mechanics of breathing and respiration allow the oxygen to come into our lungs. Gas is exchanged between the blood and the lungs, and then the blood and the tissues. That oxygen is used to break down the glucose. In fact, and we'll get to this later, but oxygen acts as the final electron acceptor in the electron transport chain. We will see exactly where oxygen is used. Maybe Monday. We'll see if we get that far. I doubt it. So probably a week from Wednesday. So why do we need oxygen? Because it acts as the final electron acceptor in electron transport. Why do we need oxygen? Acts as the final electron acceptor. Why do we breathe? To bring in the oxygen and to get rid of the carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is a byproduct of cellular respiration, specifically from the matrix reactions. Okay?
What were the membrane reactions again?
Electron transport and oxidative phosphorylation. We'll go get into specific details for each one.